The cool photos alone would be worth the tar in my guts. The jaundice on my skin, my mom would hate it, and that wouldn't change a thing. I wouldn't have to speak as often, and I sometimes don't have much to say, but I'd have something to keep me occupied whenever I felt strange in my own silence. It's easier to be alone and quiet if your mouth is busy.
Oh gosh, that's the hardest question on the book. Poetry is the mix of, I'd say, art and visceral art and the absolute self.
It's the way you say the things that otherwise you would just feel and not be able to communicate with other people.
Poetry is literally, it's in this sweater right now. Like, poetry is just life. I don't know how else to explain it.
It's basically when you take everything about your circumstances and you find a way to just channel it into a moment where you just have utter creativity flowing.
It's in any form and any way you want to speak, just anything that you need to expel from yourself, which sounds kind of weird, but just in this cathartic kind of way. If it's a rant, if it's an I love you poem, if it's a f you poem, all of that is poetry to me.
The second time I saw her was that same day. I opened my door and she happened to be standing in the doorway directly opposite mine. I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. She heard me call her and her roommate sassy, and neither of them appreciated that, but it's funny, if I hadn't done that, I don't think we'd ever had that drunken conversation chilling on the floor of the hallway.
Okay, well, I started writing poetry in 6th grade, so I have to think back. But I guess before that, it's gonna sound really cliche, but the first thing that would pop to mind would be like Shakespeare in full garb with like that neck ruffle thing.
So there's always like that stereotypical image of the dark, tortured soul who smokes cigarettes and wears a lot of dark colors and just sits on random stoops doing things. But I think it was mostly after coming to Spit that I realized pretty much everyone is a poet. Like, you could be walking around this campus, see someone who looks really happy all the time, and you walk into this room and realize that they're just as tortured as you are. So.
At the lake shore, I discovered a young birch tree, split at the roots, and burnt pages of bark littered on the sand. Water smoldered in the leaves. I left my crumpled petals to the flow of the lake.
Poetry is the most raw form of expression I have ever found. And they don't teach you that in school, because in school it's all about the rules and the metaphors and the similes, and all of that's great. Like, it teaches you to be a great writer, but they don't tell you that it's okay to break the rules sometimes.
I had a teacher once tell me that she thinks poetry is literature in a hurry. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that.
Because poetry is real life, and I don't really think that in a classroom you get that lesson necessarily. I mean, you get to learn about the greats and how they did it, but you don't really get the truth of the matter, which is that anyone can write poetry, anyone can be a poet, because poetry is what you live and breathe, it's your experience.